Welcome back, Midnight Stories family. Get ready for another heart-touching tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's dive into today's story. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, its rhythm blending with the faint hum of the city outside. The air in the dimly lit room was thick, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the lingering traces of her perfume, one he didn't recognize. Mark sat motionless in the shadow of the doorway, his heart pounding as he stared at the two figures just a few feet away. There she was, his wife, Emma, leaning closer than necessary toward a man who wasn't him. The man's tailored suit and confident posture painted a picture of someone who knew his way around situations like this. Mark's breath hitched as he caught the subtle glances they exchanged, their voices too low for him to hear but their body language screaming a truth he didn't want to face. The flickering light from the overhead bulb cast shifting shadows, amplifying the unease clawing at his chest. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he debated his next move. Confront them? Walk away. Pretend he hadn't seen the way her hand grazed the man's arm, her laughter soft yet laced with something unfamiliar, something forbidden. Mark's world seemed to tilt as he tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. His mind raced, recalling the nights she'd come home late, the faint excuses about work deadlines, the sudden guardedness of her phone. He had brushed it off, trusting her until now. As shadows stretched across the room, a secret was about to unfold, one that would change everything. Mark Thompson was the kind of man who preferred simplicity. His world revolved around order. His job, his home, and his life followed a rhythm he found comforting. A systems analyst with a penchant for detail, Mark believed that life, much like his work, could be approached methodically. Problems had solutions, patterns could be decoded, and if something went wrong it could always be fixed. At least that's what he used to believe. Mark had met Emma during their college years, back when life was less complicated and love felt like an adventure. She was the kind of woman who seemed larger than life. While Mark was content to blend into the background, Emma thrived on attention. She was charismatic, confident, and undeniably magnetic. People were drawn to her, and Mark was no exception. He'd been captivated by her from the moment they met, and for a time, it seemed she felt the same. Their relationship began like most young romances, filled with hope and the promise of forever. Emma's energy balanced Mark's quiet nature, and he loved the way she made him feel alive. They were a team, dreaming of a future filled with possibilities. Mark worked hard to support those dreams, taking on extra shifts and living frugally so they could build a life together. When Emma landed her first job in corporate communications, it felt like their sacrifices were finally paying off. But as the years went by, the dynamics began to shift. Emma's career soared, bringing with it long hours, demanding clients, and a lifestyle that often left Mark feeling like a spectator in his own marriage. While he admired her drive, he couldn't help but feel a growing distance between them. Emma was always on the move. Business trips, late-night meetings, and networking events seemed to take precedence over their time together. Mark, on the other hand, lived a quieter life. He found solace in the routine of his work, where his expertise was valued and his contributions were clear. But outside the office he often felt invisible. Emma's world was fast-paced and exciting, filled with people who spoke a language he didn't fully understand. He would listen patiently as she recounted stories of boardroom victories and corporate intrigue, but the truth was, he felt out of place in her world. The cracks in their marriage began to appear gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Emma's phone became a source of tension, always buzzing with messages and calls she was reluctant to share. Mark told himself it was work-related, a necessary part of her job, but the secrecy gnawed at him. Then there were the late nights, the sudden changes in plans, and the guarded expressions she wore when she thought he wasn't looking. Emma, for her part, carried her own struggles. The corporate world was ruthless, and staying ahead required sacrifices she hadn't anticipated. Her boss, Richard Calloway, was both a mentor and a challenge. Richard was a man who knew how to get what he wanted, and Emma had learned to navigate his demanding nature with a mix of charm and professionalism. But lately, his attention had taken on a personal edge that left her feeling uneasy. Richard was the kind of man who thrived on power. Charismatic and influential, he had a way of making people feel both important and disposable at the same time. Emma knew better than to let her guard down around him, but the lines between professional and personal had started to blur. He would find excuses to keep her late, inviting her to dinner under the guise of discussing business. Emma convinced herself it was harmless, just part of the job, but deep down, she knew it was more complicated than that. Mark began to notice the changes in Emma's demeanor. She was distracted, her mind elsewhere even when they were together. She spoke less about her day, offering vague explanations that only fueled his suspicions. He tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but it became harder with each passing day. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark had been organizing their shared office space when he stumbled upon a receipt tucked between Emma's files. It was from an upscale restaurant he knew they had never visited together. The date matched one of her late-night meetings, and the expense was far more than what he'd expect for a solo meal. His heart sank as he stared at the piece of paper, a small but undeniable piece of evidence that something wasn't right. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he kept the receipt, folding it carefully and placing it in his desk drawer. He told himself he was overthinking, that there was a reasonable explanation. But as the days turned into weeks, his doubts only grew stronger. Emma's world, too, was unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Richard's attention had become more overt, and she found herself walking a tightrope between maintaining her professionalism and keeping her career intact. She didn't know how to talk to Mark about it, how to explain the pressure she felt, the choices she was being forced to make. Their conversations, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become strained, punctuated by silences that spoke louder than words. Mark's best friend, Liam, noticed the change in him. Liam had always been protective of Mark, a constant presence in his life since high school. He was the one who had warned Mark about Emma's growing distance, but Mark had brushed him off, unwilling to believe that the woman he loved could betray him. Still, Liam's words lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder that not everything was as it seemed. The tension reached its breaking point on a quiet evening at home. Emma was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while Mark watched her from across the room. The sight of her, so absorbed in her own world, was both familiar and alien. He wanted to reach out to ask her what was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he retreated to the bedroom, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. As Mark lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized that the life he thought he knew was slipping away. Emma was a mystery he could no longer solve, and the love they once shared felt like a distant memory. For the first time, he wondered if the truth was something he didn't want to uncover. But deep down he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Behind closed doors, their lives were anything but ordinary. And the secrets they carried were about to come crashing into the open. Mark's quiet world began to shift with increasing frequency, like the tremors before a massive earthquake. Emma's late nights at the office and impromptu work trips had become so routine that Mark started marking them on the calendar, not as events, but as absences, silent placeholders for when he'd find himself eating dinner alone or watching TV with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. The receipt he found in her files haunted him, but it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a gateway to a realization he had avoided for months. He'd replayed the night he discovered it countless times, searching for clues he might have missed. The restaurant's name stood out, an exclusive venue downtown that Emma had once mentioned in passing, saying it was a place for people who want to impress. The thought churned his stomach. Who had she been trying to impress that night? Emma's behavior only added to the mounting unease. She had always been ambitious, but now her ambition felt different, colder, calculated, as if she were chasing something more than just success. She carried herself with a new air of confidence that felt foreign, a quiet arrogance that hinted at secrets she wasn't sharing. Conversations between them became transactional, stripped of the warmth they once shared. Mark would ask how her day went, and her replies were curt, riddled with vague mentions of meetings and deadlines. When he pressed for details, she would sigh, claiming exhaustion, and retreat to the bedroom with her phone in hand. What seemed thrilling in the moment was quickly spiraling out of control. Emma's relationship with Richard Calloway was a masterclass in professional ambiguity. On the surface, their dynamic was strictly business, but beneath the polished veneer, an undercurrent of tension hinted at something more. Richard was a man who thrived on power games, and Emma was his newest pawn. He would shower her with praise during meetings, complimenting her ideas in a way that felt too personal, too intimate. Emma knew better than to let his flattery cloud her judgment, but she couldn't deny the advantages of being in his good graces. Richard's influence extended far beyond the walls of their office. He had connections that could make or break careers, and Emma was acutely aware of how precarious her position was. Rejecting his advances outright wasn't an option, not if she wanted to keep her career intact. So, she danced the delicate line, appeasing him just enough to keep the peace while trying to maintain her dignity. But the more she gave, the more he seemed to take, his demands becoming bolder with each passing day. The turning point came during an out-of-town conference, one Emma hadn't mentioned to Mark until the night before. She framed it as a last-minute obligation, a critical opportunity to showcase her skills. Mark had nodded, masking his disappointment with a tight smile. But when Emma returned, she seemed distant, her usual post-trip enthusiasm replaced by an uncharacteristic quiet. Mark noticed the faint trace of cologne on her jacket, one that didn't belong to him, and his mind raced with possibilities he wasn't ready to confront. Meanwhile, Mark found himself slipping into the role of an investigator, piecing together the fragments of Emma's life she seemed intent on hiding. He checked her social media profiles, scrolling through photos of networking events and corporate dinners, searching for any sign of Richard or anyone else who might explain the changes in her behavior. He even considered checking her phone but stopped himself, unwilling to cross a line he might not recover from. As the weeks passed, Mark's suspicions began to consume him. He started leaving work early, hoping to catch Emma off guard. One evening, he arrived home to find her in the middle of a phone call. She didn't hear him enter, and her tone was hushed, her words clipped. He lingered in the hallway, straining to catch snippets of the conversation. The name Richard slipped from her lips, followed by a soft laugh that sent a jolt of anger through him. When she noticed him, she ended the call abruptly, offering a weak excuse about a last-minute project. The cracks in their marriage grew deeper, and the risks Emma was taking began to escalate. Richard, emboldened by her reluctant compliance, started pushing boundaries. He invited her to exclusive dinners, framing them as networking opportunities. He suggested late-night strategy sessions that seemed to serve no purpose other than keeping her close. Emma felt trapped, her options narrowing with every decision she made. She told herself it was temporary, that she could handle the situation, but the weight of her choices was beginning to crush her. Mark, on the other hand, was reaching his breaking point. The man who once prided himself on logic and reason found himself consumed by emotions he couldn't control. He started losing focus at work, his mind constantly drifting to Emma and the secret she was keeping. His colleagues noticed the change, offering concerned comments he brushed off with forced smiles. One night, Mark decided to follow her. She had mentioned another late meeting, her tone casual but unconvincing. As she left the house, Mark grabbed his keys and trailed her car at a safe distance. His heart pounded as he watched her pull into the parking lot of an upscale hotel, his worst fears taking shape before his eyes. He parked across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When she stepped out of the car, Richard was already waiting for her, his hand resting on her lower back as they walked inside. The sight shattered something inside Mark. He sat in the car for what felt like hours, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He thought about confronting her, storming into the hotel and demanding answers, but the idea felt hollow. What would he say? What could he do that wouldn't make the situation worse? Back at home, Mark replayed the night in his mind, his emotions oscillating between fury and despair. He wanted to hate Emma, to blame her for the lies in the distance, but a part of him clung to the hope that there was an explanation, something that would make sense of the chaos. He spent the night on the couch, unable to face the bed they once shared. What seemed thrilling in the moment was quickly spiraling out of control. Emma returned home the next morning, her expression carefully neutral. She offered a vague explanation about the meeting running late and crashing at a colleague's place to avoid the drive home. Mark nodded, his face a mask of indifference, but inside he was unraveling. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth, whatever it was, felt closer than ever. But the closer he got, the more he feared what he might find. Mark's sleepless nights became a routine he didn't want but couldn't escape. The once serene hours after dinner, where he and Emma would curl up on the couch and share mundane stories about their day, were now marked by a void. His thoughts were no longer his own. They revolved entirely around Emma and the increasingly obvious secrets she was keeping. Every hour spent awake brought new questions, each one darker than the last. The memory of Emma and Richard walking into the hotel was more than an image. It was a wound that refused to heal. Mark couldn't forget the way Emma had laughed at something Richard said, her body language relaxed and intimate. It was the kind of comfort she hadn't shown with him in months. The idea of her sharing parts of herself, her humor, her charm, with someone else clawed at him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Emma's behavior grew more inconsistent. She wasn't just avoiding eye contact anymore, she was avoiding being in the same room. She would shuffle in after midnight, her heels in hand to avoid making noise, and retreat to the bathroom for an unusually long time. Mark noticed how she would linger by the sink, her hands gripping the edges of the counter as if steadying herself. When she finally emerged, she would mumble a faint goodnight and slip into bed, her back turned to him. With every move, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The notebook Mark kept grew heavier with details he wished he could forget. He wasn't just tracking her late nights anymore. He began writing down her moods, the scents she carried home, the way her voice changed when she mentioned work. One entry read, "Wore the red scarf I gave her last Christmas. Haven't seen her wear it since. Why tonight? Who noticed it?" The act of documenting his suspicions felt intrusive, but he justified it by telling himself it was the only way to find clarity in the chaos. Emma's entanglement with Richard deepened, though not by choice. Richard's charm, once professional and encouraging, had turned into something far more personal. He began touching her arm during conversations, holding her gaze just a little too long. Emma felt the shift but didn't know how to address it without jeopardizing her career. The stakes were too high. Richard wasn't just her boss, he was a gateway to opportunities she couldn't afford to lose. Still, each interaction with him left her feeling more trapped than empowered. One evening, Richard invited Emma to a small gathering at his penthouse under the guise of networking. She knew it wasn't just about work, but declining his invitation felt like the wrong move. The gathering was intimate, with only a handful of people, all laughing too loudly and sipping wine that tasted expensive. Emma spent most of the night avoiding Richard's gaze, pretending to be engrossed in conversations about market trends and quarterly reports. But Richard's presence loomed, a constant reminder of the line she was trying desperately not to cross. At home, Mark was spiraling. He found himself staring at their wedding photo, the one that used to hang in the hallway but had been replaced with a modern art print Emma insisted was more mature. The photo now sat in the storage closet, its frame gathering dust. He couldn't look at it without feeling a pang of regret. How had they gone from that day full of hope and promises, to this fractured reality? Mark's isolation wasn't lost on Liam. Over drinks one night, Liam pressed Mark for answers. "You're not yourself, man. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." Mark hesitated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It's Emma. I can't shake the feeling that she's hiding something. And it's killing me." Liam's jaw tightened. "You deserve to know the truth. Whatever it is, you can't let this eat you alive." Mark nodded, but the words did little to ease his mind. The truth felt like a double-edged sword, necessary but dangerous. The following week, Mark's resolve hardened. When Emma left for another business dinner, he waited 15 minutes before grabbing his car keys and following her. He kept his distance, his palms slick with sweat as he tailed her through the city. When she parked at the same hotel as before, he knew he wasn't imagining things. His stomach churned as he watched her step out of the car, her movements smooth and deliberate. Richard arrived minutes later, his car pulling up alongside hers. They greeted each other with smiles that sent a wave of nausea through Mark. This time, Mark didn't stop at the parking lot. He followed them inside, staying just far enough behind to remain unnoticed. The hotel lobby was grand, with marble floors and chandeliers that reflected light like shattered diamonds. Mark's heart raced as he watched them approach the elevator. When the doors closed behind them, he froze. He wanted to run after them to demand answers, but the weight of what he might find kept him rooted in place. Back home, Emma's return was predictable, calm, calculated, and utterly maddening. She slipped off her heels, placed her bag on the counter, and turned to Mark with a practiced smile. "Hey, you're still up?" "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice tight. "Couldn't sleep?" Emma nodded, pouring herself a glass of water. "Long day?" "Something like that." His eyes bore into her, searching for cracks in her facade. Emma avoided his gaze, focusing on her water. "I'm going to head to bed. Good night." As she walked away, Mark called after her. "Emma?" She stopped but didn't turn around. "What?" "I followed you tonight," he said, his voice steady but low. I saw you. Emma froze, her shoulders stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Mark said, standing up. I saw you with him. At the hotel. Do you think I'm stupid? Emma's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she composed herself. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Mark demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're lying to me. Emma's silence was deafening. For the first time, Mark saw fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but fear of the truth coming to light. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his anger threatening to spill over, but it was the look in Emma's eyes that stopped him. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was fear, pure, unfiltered fear. And that scared him more than anything else. Say something, Emma, he demanded, his voice breaking. Anything. Emma finally looked away, her hands trembling as she set the glass of water on the counter. Mark, she began, her voice barely a whisper. It's not what you think. Stop saying that. Mark shouted, slamming his fist against the table. The sound echoed through the room, startling them both. I saw you. I followed you. Don't insult me by pretending this is all in my head. Emma took a step back, her eyes darting toward the doorway as if contemplating an escape. I didn't mean for this to happen, she stammered, her voice cracking. Mark's breath hitched. The words felt like a dagger, confirming what he already knew but desperately wished wasn't true. Didn't mean for what to happen? He pressed, his tone sharp. Say it, Emma. I need to hear you say it. Emma's shoulders slumped as though the weight of her secret had finally crushed her. It started as work, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. He's my boss, Mark. I didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice? Mark repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. You're telling me you had no control over sneaking off to hotels with him? Over lying to me every night? Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but Mark was too far gone to care. I was trapped, she said, her voice quivering. He's not just my boss. He has influence, connections. If I said no, it wouldn't just hurt my career. It would ruin me. Mark let out a bitter laugh. So what? You decided to protect yourself at the expense of our marriage? Did you even think about what this would do to us? To me? Emma's tears spilled over, but she didn't respond. The silence was deafening, and Mark felt his world collapse around him. Everything he had built, everything he thought he knew was gone. In one moment, everything they thought they knew was shattered. Mark's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the change in her demeanor. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. Emma had betrayed him, and there was no going back. Was it worth it? He asked, his voice hollow. Was he worth it? Emma shook her head, her tears falling faster. It wasn't about him, she said. It was about survival. Mark stared at her, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Survival? He repeated. You call this survival? Destroying the one person who would have done anything for you? Emma tried to step closer, but Mark held up a hand to stop her. Don't, he said firmly. You don't get to play the victim here. Not after what you've done. The room fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Mark's hands were shaking, his emotions a volatile mix of rage, heartbreak, and betrayal. Emma finally spoke, her voice soft and broken. I never meant to hurt you, Mark. I swear. Mark let out a hollow laugh. Well, congratulations, he said bitterly. You succeeded. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Mark couldn't stay in the house. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it did little to calm his racing thoughts. He walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind replaying their conversation over and over. Each word felt like a wound, cutting deeper with every step. Emma stayed behind, collapsing onto the couch as sobs racked her body. She knew she had made a mess of everything, but she didn't know how to fix it. The walls of their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She buried her face in her hands, her mind swirling with regret and shame. Mark eventually found himself at Liam's doorstep. His best friend opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw the state Mark was in. Mark? What happened? Liam asked, stepping aside to let him in. Mark didn't speak right away. He sat on the couch, his head in his hands, struggling to find the words. Finally he looked up at Liam, his eyes red and glassy. She admitted it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been with him? Liam's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. I knew something was off, he said, his voice low. But I didn't want to believe it. Mark shook his head. I don't know what to do, Liam. I can't even look at her right now. You don't have to make any decisions tonight, Liam said, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. Stay here as long as you need. We'll figure this out together. Meanwhile, Emma's world began to unravel. Richard called her the next morning, his tone casual as he asked if everything was all right. Emma hesitated before replying, her voice strained. I told him, she said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That was bold, Richard said finally. Do you think he'll keep quiet? Emma's stomach turned at the implication. Mark's not like that, she said firmly. He's not going to expose anything. You'd better hope not, Richard said, his tone cold. Because if he does, this will get very messy, for both of us. Emma hung up, her hands trembling. She realized too late that she had placed herself in an impossible position. She had hurt the man she loved, tied herself to a man she despised, and now she had no idea how to escape the wreckage. Mark too was at a crossroads. The betrayal had left him broken, but it also lit a fire within him. He knew he couldn't ignore what had happened, but he also couldn't let it define him. As the days passed, he began to see the situation more clearly. He realized that the only way to move forward was to confront the truth head-on, no matter how painful it might be. The truth had come to light, but the fallout was far from over. For Mark and Emma, the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges they couldn't yet see. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Mark woke up at Liam's place the next morning, his head pounding and his chest heavy. The previous night's events felt like a blur, but the pain was sharp and fresh. The thought of returning home made his stomach churn, yet he knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable. He owed himself clarity even if it hurt. Back at the house, Emma sat in their once shared bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her puffy eyes and tear-streaked face mirrored the mess she felt inside. She had spent the night replaying every decision that had led to this moment, searching for a way to undo the damage. But there was no going back. Every choice had its cost and she was paying dearly. Mark's return. When Mark finally stepped through the front door, the air was thick with tension. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes pleading, but Mark avoided her gaze. I only came to grab some things, he said curtly, his voice devoid of emotion. I'll stay at Liam's until I figure out what's next. Emma's throat tightened, but she nodded. Can we at least talk? She asked, her voice trembling. Please? Mark paused, his hand hovering over the duffel bag he had left in the hallway. He turned slowly to face her. Talk about what, Emma? How you lied to me. How you destroyed everything we built together? Emma flinched at his words. I know I messed up, Mark. I know I hurt you. But You chose to hurt me, Mark interrupted, his voice rising. You had a choice, Emma, and you didn't choose us. Tears filled Emma's eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. Emma's desperation. In the days that followed, Emma tried to reach out to Mark, but her calls and messages went unanswered. She poured her energy into work, hoping to distract herself, but the weight of her actions was impossible to ignore. Richard, sensing her vulnerability, began pressing her for more. His calls became more frequent, his demands more aggressive. One afternoon, during a meeting, Richard cornered Emma in his office. I don't like loose ends, he said, his tone icy. Your husband's silence is a liability. Emma's heart raced. Mark won't say anything, she insisted. He's not like that. Richard leaned closer, his presence suffocating. Let's hope you're right. Because if he does, this little arrangement of ours won't end well, for either of you. Emma left the office feeling trapped. Richard's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger she had invited into their lives. Mark's growing resolve. At Liam's, Mark began to piece together his next steps. He spent hours staring at the wall, trying to decide whether he could ever forgive Emma or if it was time to move on. Liam encouraged him to take his time, but Mark's anger simmered just below the surface, fueling his need for closure. One evening, Liam sat down beside him. What are you going to do? He asked gently. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Part of me wants to confront Richard, but what's the point? It won't change anything. It might not change the past, Liam said, but it might give you some peace. You deserve that much. Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. Maybe you're right. The confrontation. A week later, Mark made his decision. He drove to Richard's office, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He waited in the parking lot, watching as employees filtered out for the day. When Richard finally appeared, Mark stepped out of the car and intercepted him. "Mark Thompson," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Mark's blood boiled at the smugness in Richard's tone. "You know exactly why I'm here," he said coldly. "Stay away from my wife." Richard smirked, leaning casually against his car. "Your wife made her own choices, Thompson. Don't blame me for her decisions." Mark stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You manipulated her. You made her feel like she didn't have a choice." Richard's expression hardened. "She knew what she was doing. If you can't handle that, maybe you're the problem." Before Mark could stop himself, his fist connected with Richard's jaw. The force sent Richard staggering back, clutching his face. A few bystanders stopped to watch, their murmurs filling the tense air. Richard straightened, wiping blood from his lip. "You'll regret that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Mark didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his chest heaving. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of relief. Emma's turning point. When Emma heard about the confrontation, she was horrified. She rushed to Liam's house, her desperation evident in the way she pounded on the door. Mark opened it, his face a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What are you doing here?" Emma stepped inside, her words spilling out in a rush. "I heard about what happened with Richard. Are you okay?" Mark crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Why do you care? You're the reason this happened." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I'm sorry. I never wanted any of this." "Then why did you let it happen?" Mark demanded. "Why didn't you come to me?" Emma hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of losing my job, scared of disappointing you, scared of everything. I didn't know how to fix it." Mark's anger softened slightly, but his hurt remained. "You should have trusted me, Emma. We could have faced it together." Emma nodded, her tears falling freely. "I know. I was wrong, Mark. I've been wrong about so many things. But I want to fix this. I want to fix us. The cost of their choices." The fallout from Richard's manipulation and Emma's betrayal left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. Mark and Emma began attending counseling, their sessions filled with difficult conversations and raw emotions. It was a slow, painful process, but both were committed to rebuilding what had been broken. Richard, meanwhile, faced his own consequences. Mark's punch had left more than just a physical mark. It sparked rumors that spread quickly through the office. Employees began sharing their own stories of Richard's behavior, and soon an investigation was launched. Richard was forced to resign, his once flawless reputation in shambles. The cost of their choices was now impossible to ignore. Mark and Emma's journey was far from over, but they were learning to navigate the wreckage together. Trust would take time to rebuild, and forgiveness would not come easily. But in the quiet moments when they sat together and talked openly for the first time in years, they both realized that perhaps, just maybe, their love was worth saving. Mark sat in his car outside Richard's office for the third day in a row. Each time, he'd arrived determined to confront the man who had torn his life apart, only to falter, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was about to do. This time felt different. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set as he replayed Emma's words in his mind. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix it." Her voice still echoed with regret, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. The betrayal wasn't just about her actions. It was the choices that made Mark question everything he thought he knew about her and their marriage. His hurt had given way to anger, and that anger now burned hot enough to push him out of the car and across the street. The confrontation. Mark entered the building, his heart pounding like a war drum. He approached the receptionist, his voice calm but firm. "I need to see Richard Calloway." The woman behind the desk looked him over, her expression unreadable. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Mark replied, his tone icy. "But he'll want to see me." Something in his demeanor must have convinced her because, after a moment's hesitation, she picked up the phone. A brief conversation later, she gestured toward the elevator. He's on the top floor. The ride up felt endless. Mark's reflection in the mirrored walls stared back at him, a man both broken and determined. When the doors opened, he stepped into a lavish office, the air thick with the scent of leather and expensive cologne. Richard sat behind a massive desk, his smug smile fading the moment he saw Mark. "Mark Thompson," Richard drawled, leaning back in his chair. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to show up here. What can I do for you?" Mark's fists clenched at his sides. "You can start by staying the hell away from my wife." Richard smirked, as if the confrontation was a game he had already won. "Your wife is a grown woman," he said, his tone condescending. "She made her own decisions." Mark stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You manipulated her. You used your power to trap her. And you think I'm going to let you get away with it?" Richard's expression hardened. "Let me make something clear, Thompson. Whatever issues you have with your wife are between the two of you. Don't drag me into your marital problems." Mark's restraint snapped. He leaned over the desk, his voice a growl. "You already dragged yourself into this when you crossed the line. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." Richard's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You've had your say. Now get out of my office." Mark straightened, his gaze cold. "This isn't over." Emma's desperation. While Mark was confronting Richard, Emma was facing her own reckoning. She had spent the past week spiraling, consumed by guilt and fear. Richard's threats loomed large in her mind, but they were nothing compared to the weight of losing Mark. She knew she had made unforgivable mistakes, but she wasn't ready to give up on their marriage, not yet. That evening, Emma sat in their dimly lit living room, waiting for Mark to return. She rehearsed what she would say, her heart pounding with every imagined conversation. When the front door finally opened, her breath caught. Mark stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He set his keys on the counter and turned to face her. "We need to talk." Emma nodded, her voice barely audible. "I know." They sat across from each other, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Mark was the first to speak. "I went to see him." Emma's eyes widened. "You what?" "I confronted Richard," Mark said, his voice steady. "I told him to stay away from you." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. "Mark, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he interrupted. "Because no one else was going to hold him accountable. But this isn't just about him, Emma. It's about us." Emma's tears spilled over and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." Mark's anger softened as he watched her crumble. He wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the pain because it felt safer than letting her back in. But seeing her like this, so vulnerable and broken, stirred something deeper within him. "We can't go back to the way things were," he said finally. "But maybe, we can start over." Emma looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you mean that?" Mark nodded, though the road ahead felt daunting. "It's not going to be easy. We'll have to rebuild everything from the ground up." "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Emma said, her voice firm despite her tears. "I just want us back." The fallout. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mark and Emma began attending therapy, a process that forced them to confront their pain head-on. The sessions were raw and emotional, filled with moments of anger and vulnerability. But they also brought moments of clarity, as both began to understand the roles they had played in the breakdown of their marriage. Meanwhile, Richard's empire was crumbling. Word of Mark's confrontation spread through the office, and whispers of his inappropriate behavior began to surface. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak up found their voices, and an investigation was launched. Within weeks, Richard was forced to resign, his reputation in tatters. For Mark and Emma, the climax of their story was not a neat resolution but a turning point. They had reached the edge of the cliff and chosen to step back instead of falling. The path forward was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk together. As the truth emerged, there was no turning back. The weeks following the confrontation unfolded like chapters in a novel neither Mark nor Emma had wanted to write. Their once familiar home felt like uncharted territory, every room a reminder of what had been lost and what still remained. The days were a blur of cautious conversations and tentative glances, while the nights stretched long and silent. Yet, in the quiet there was a sense of rebuilding, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Mark struggled with the complexity of his emotions. Forgiveness didn't come easily and he wasn't sure it ever would. But he found solace in therapy, where he could unpack the anger, hurt, and lingering love he still felt for Emma. It was there, in those sterile yet safe spaces, that he began to understand the full scope of what had happened, not just Emma's choices but his own role in their drifting apart. He hadn't been blameless. The cracks in their relationship had formed long before Richard entered the picture, and now it was up to both of them to decide whether those cracks could be filled or if they'd become permanent fractures. Emma, too, was on a journey of self-discovery. The shame of her betrayal hung heavy on her, but instead of letting it paralyze her, she used it as motivation. She threw herself into therapy and made amends wherever she could. Her decision to report Richard to HR had been terrifying, but it sparked a wave of courage among her colleagues. What started as a single complaint grew into a collective voice, and soon Richard's reign of intimidation came to an end. He resigned under pressure, his legacy reduced to whispers of disgrace. The fallout at work was both a relief and a reminder for Emma. She had escaped Richard's control, but the damage to her personal life couldn't be undone so easily. She found herself rediscovering who she was outside of her career, a woman who had once been full of dreams and ambitions beyond the boardroom. She started volunteering at a community center teaching public speaking to young women. It was a small step, but one that reminded her of her own strength and the importance of using it for good. Relearning the language of love. Mark and Emma's attempts to reconnect felt, at times, like learning a foreign language. Their communication was halting and awkward, but they both knew it was worth the effort. On one particularly quiet evening, Mark suggested they revisit a tradition they'd let fall away over the years, cooking dinner together. In the kitchen, Emma chopped vegetables while Mark prepared the pasta. The air was filled with the aroma of garlic and basil, a scent that transported them back to the early days of their marriage. They laughed over a mishap with the sauce, and for the first time in months, the tension between them eased. "Do you remember the first meal we cooked together?" Emma asked, her smile tinged with nostalgia. Mark chuckled. "How could I forget? We burned half of it, and the other half was barely edible." Emma laughed, the sound light and genuine. "And we ate it anyway because we didn't want to admit we were terrible cooks." Mark paused, looking at her with a softness that hadn't been there in a long time. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "We have. And I want to keep going, Mark. I want us to keep finding our way. Rebuilding trust." Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. There were moments of doubt and insecurity, times when Mark wondered if he could ever truly move past what had happened. But then there were moments of clarity, Emma's unwavering commitment to transparency, her willingness to answer his questions without defensiveness. Slowly, those moments began to outweigh the doubts. One evening, Mark came home to find Emma sitting on the couch with an old photo album in her lap. "Look what I found," she said, patting the space next to her. Mark sat down and together they flipped through the pages. There were pictures of their college days, their wedding, vacations they'd taken, and candid shots of the life they'd built. Each photo told a story, and as they reminisced, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Their past wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with Emma in the first place. The ripple effect. Richard's resignation sent ripples through Emma's workplace. Policies were overhauled, and the company implemented training programs to ensure no one else would experience what Emma had endured. For Emma, the changes were bittersweet. She had paid a high price, but seeing the impact of her actions gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Mark, too, found himself stepping into a new chapter. Inspired by Emma's volunteer work, he began mentoring at-risk teens in his community. He taught them about resilience, about finding strength in adversity, and about the importance of making choices that align with their values. The experience was transformative, giving him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't realized he was missing. A new beginning. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Mark and Emma found themselves walking through the park where they'd had their first date. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was filled with the faint scent of earth and falling leaves. They stopped at a bench overlooking the lake, the same bench where Mark had proposed years ago. Mark turned to Emma, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we've changed too much to make this work?" he asked. Emma reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. "We've both changed," she said. "But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this is our chance to build something even stronger." Mark smiled, the tension in his chest easing. You're probably right. We've been through too much to give up now. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunlight dance on the water. In that moment, they weren't just a couple trying to rebuild their marriage. They were two people who had faced their flaws, their fears, and their failures and come out stronger on the other side. Final reflection. As silence fell, the echoes of their choices lingered in the air. Mark and Emma's story wasn't one of perfect reconciliation or a neatly tied resolution. It was messy, complicated, and deeply human. They weren't the same people who had walked into their marriage all those years ago, and they weren't the same people who had almost walked away from it. They were something new, imperfect, but resilient. And as they sat together, hand in hand, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. For them, the past was a lesson, the present a gift, and the future an opportunity. And in the quiet of that autumn afternoon, they found peace, not in forgetting what had happened, but in choosing to move forward anyway. The past has a way of creeping back even when buried deep. Mark hadn't thought about his childhood in years. It wasn't that it was particularly traumatic, at least not in ways he could recognize at the time, but it wasn't happy either. His father was a disciplinarian, a man who believed silence was strength and emotions were for the weak. Love was never spoken aloud. It was implied in the roof over their heads, the food on the table, and the shoes on their feet. Affection, as Mark learned, wasn't given freely, it was earned. It was during a therapy session that the memories began to resurface, uninvited but persistent. His therapist had asked a simple question: "What does trust mean to you, Mark?" He'd opened his mouth to respond but found himself frozen. The word trust felt foreign, something he'd never truly understood. The session ended with him shaken, unsure of why a single question had unraveled him so completely. That night, alone at Liam's apartment, he stared at the ceiling, replaying fragments of his childhood he hadn't revisited in decades. Mark's father. His father had been the kind of man who demanded respect without earning it. Mark remembered the heavy footsteps that signaled his father's return home, the way his mother would tense, her movements becoming quieter as though afraid of setting him off. The few times Mark dared to question his father's authority, he was met with a cold stare that froze him in place. "You don't question me, boy. You listen and you learn." The lessons were often harsh. Mark once spilled a glass of milk during dinner, and his father's reaction was swift and brutal, a torrent of criticism about carelessness and failure. It wasn't the words themselves that stuck with Mark but the look in his father's eyes. Disappointment, as if Mark had failed some unspoken test. From that moment on, Mark vowed to be perfect, to never give his father a reason to look at him that way again. But perfection came at a cost. Mark learned to suppress his emotions, to bury his vulnerabilities beneath a facade of composure. He became the dutiful son, the hardworking student, the reliable friend. He built a life that appeared steady and unshakable, but beneath it all, he was a man terrified of being seen as anything less than perfect. Emma's hidden struggles. Emma's childhood had been the opposite, a whirlwind of chaos and unpredictability. Her parents were dreamers, artists who chased passions more than stability. Her father was a painter, her mother a poet, and their home was filled with color and creativity but little else. Bills often went unpaid and Emma grew up learning to fend for herself. While other kids had lunchboxes filled with homemade meals, Emma often made do with whatever scraps she could find in their nearly empty pantry. Her parents loved her, of that she had no doubt. But their love was fleeting, scattered between gallery showings and poetry readings. They didn't notice when Emma stayed up late doing her homework by candlelight or when she skipped meals to save money for art supplies. She promised herself that her life would be different, that she would build a foundation so solid that no storm could shake it. Emma's drive for success wasn't born out of ambition but necessity. She climbed the corporate ladder with a single-minded determination, collecting accolades and promotions as if they were armor against the uncertainty of her past. But with every step she climbed, the pressure grew heavier. She couldn't let herself falter, not when she'd worked so hard to escape the life she'd left behind. The hidden truths unveiled. One night, as Mark and Emma sat in their therapist's office, their individual pasts collided in a way neither had expected. The session had begun as usual, with tentative questions and guarded answers. But when the therapist asked Emma to describe her fears, something shifted. "I'm afraid of losing everything," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked so hard to get where I am and sometimes I feel like if I stop moving it'll all fall apart." Mark turned to her, his expression softening. You don't have to do it alone, Emma. You never did. Emma looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. But you don't understand, Mark. I didn't grow up with safety nets. There was no one to catch me if I fell. I can't afford to be vulnerable. Mark felt the words hit him like a wave. He thought of his father, of the rigid expectations that had shaped him, and suddenly he saw Emma in a new light. She wasn't just his wife, she was a survivor, someone who had carried the weight of her past alone for far too long. I know what it's like to feel like you have to be perfect, Mark said quietly. I spent my whole life trying to earn approval that never came. But perfection doesn't make us safe, Emma. It just makes us lonely. The room fell silent, the weight of their shared truths settling between them. For the first time, they saw each other not as adversaries or strangers but as two people shaped by the scars of their pasts, both searching for a way to heal. Revelation's impact. That session became a turning point. Mark began to let go of the need to always have control, learning to embrace vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. Emma, in turn, began to trust in the support Mark offered, realizing that her fear of falling didn't have to define her. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond the surface-level discussions of their daily lives. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the ways they had unknowingly hurt each other. The more they shared, the more they understood how their past had shaped their present. Mark finally confronted the anger he had buried for so long, recognizing that it wasn't Emma he was truly angry with, it was himself for not speaking up sooner, for not addressing the cracks in their relationship before they became chasms. Emma, too, faced her guilt head-on, acknowledging the choices she had made and the harm they had caused. The past's echo. The past has a way of creeping back even when buried deep. For Mark and Emma, those buried memories weren't just ghosts. They were guides, leading them toward a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. Their journey wasn't about erasing the past but learning to live with it, to let it inform their choices without dictating them. As they sat together one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark reached for Emma's hand. We've both carried a lot on our own, he said. Maybe it's time we start carrying it together. Emma smiled, her grip tightening around his. Together sounds good. In that moment, the hidden truths of their past became the foundation for their future. A future built not on perfection but on resilience, understanding, and love. Help can come from the most unlikely places, or so it seemed. Mark hadn't expected to hear from Alyssa, Emma's childhood friend. It had been years since they'd spoken, and her sudden call felt both curious and unsettling. Alyssa had always been a bit of a wild card, someone who seemed to know everything about everyone. Mark hadn't trusted her then, and he wasn't sure he trusted her now. I think we should talk, Alyssa had said, her voice unusually serious. It's about Emma? Mark hesitated, unsure whether to indulge her or hang up. What do you want, Alyssa? He asked finally. Look, I know you have no reason to trust me, but there are things you need to know. Things Emma won't tell you. Can we meet? Reluctantly, Mark agreed. The next day they met at a small cafe on the edge of town. Alyssa arrived late, her demeanor more subdued than he remembered. She ordered a coffee, fiddling with the sugar packets as if buying time to collect her thoughts. A hidden agenda? I've known Emma since we were kids, Alyssa began, her voice soft but steady. She's always been strong, driven. But she's also always carried this weight. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I don't need a history lesson, Alyssa. Get to the point. Alyssa sighed, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Emma told me about Richard. She told me everything. Mark stiffened. And what exactly do you know? That he's manipulative. Controlling. She felt like she couldn't get out, Alyssa said, her eyes locking onto Mark's. But here's the thing, you're not the only one Richard has done this to. Mark's heart pounded. What are you saying? Alyssa leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. He's done this to other women in the office. Emma wasn't the first, and she won't be the last unless someone stops him. The ally emerges. Mark's initial skepticism gave way to curiosity, then determination. Alyssa explained how she had pieced together Richard's pattern of behavior through conversations with Emma and others. She described late-night calls from Emma, her voice shaking as she recounted Richard's veiled threats and the pressure he placed on her to comply with his demands. She didn't want to tell you because she was scared, Alyssa said. Scared you'd see her differently. Scared of what it would mean for your marriage? Mark's jaw tightened. And you? Why are you telling me this now? Alyssa hesitated, her expression softening. Because Emma deserves better. And so do you. If there's even a chance you two can fix this, you need to know the whole truth. For the first time, Mark saw Alyssa not as an interloper but as someone genuinely trying to help. Her motives seemed genuine, but the question lingered. Why now? Why step in at this moment? Emma's betrayal or survival? Later that night, Mark confronted Emma with the information Alyssa had shared. Emma's face paled as he recounted the conversation, her hands trembling as she placed her wine glass on the table. You talked to Alyssa? She asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. I did, Mark said. And now I need to hear it from you. All of it? Emma took a deep breath, her gaze falling to her lap. It's true, she admitted. Everything Alyssa told you is true. Richard, he targeted me. He knew how to push just enough to make me feel trapped, like I couldn't say no without losing everything. Mark's anger flared. And you didn't think to tell me? To ask for help? Emma looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't want you to see me as weak. I didn't want you to feel like I couldn't handle things. Mark's voice softened, but his frustration remained. Emma, marriage isn't about handling things alone. It's about facing them together. A twist in loyalty. The following week, Mark received an anonymous email. The subject line read, Important information about Richard Calloway. Inside was a series of attachments, emails, texts, and photos, all implicating Richard in a pattern of predatory behavior. The sender's identity was hidden, but Mark had a suspicion. When he confronted Alyssa, she didn't deny it. I couldn't sit back and let him keep doing this, she said. Emma's not the only one who's been hurt by him. Mark didn't know whether to thank her or question her motives further. Alyssa had crossed the line by digging into Richard's personal life, but the evidence she provided was damning. It was enough to launch an investigation, and soon the company was forced to take action. Richard was fired, his reputation destroyed. But the victory was bittersweet. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Alyssa's involvement, though helpful, came with strings attached. What those strings were he wasn't sure, yet. A new ally or a hidden betrayal? As Mark and Emma worked to rebuild their relationship, Alyssa's presence lingered in the background. She claimed to want nothing in return, but her frequent calls and check-ins made Mark uneasy. Was she truly an ally, or did she have her own agenda? Emma, too, began to question Alyssa's intentions. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Emma voiced her concerns. She's always been like this, she said. Inserting herself into other people's lives. I don't know if she's doing this out of kindness or if she just wants to feel important. Mark nodded, his own doubts mirroring Emma's. Either way, we have to be careful. Despite their reservations, they couldn't deny that Alyssa had played a crucial role in exposing Richard. But her involvement had also added a layer of complexity to their lives, one they weren't sure how to navigate. Conclusion. Help can come from the most unlikely places, or so it seemed. Alyssa's actions had altered the course of Mark and Emma's story for better or worse. She had exposed truths that might have remained hidden and forced them to confront their fears head-on. But her true motives remained a mystery, leaving Mark and Emma to wonder whether she was a savior or another storm waiting to strike. In the end, they chose to focus on what mattered most, each other. Their journey was far from over, but they had learned to face the unexpected together, even when the lines between ally and adversary blurred. Some choices leave scars no matter which path you take. Mark sat alone in his car outside the park where he and Emma had spent their first anniversary. The memories of that day, their laughter, the promises they'd made, felt like relics of a distant past. The air inside the car was heavy, not just with his thoughts but with the weight of the decision that loomed over him. Could he truly forgive Emma? Could he forgive himself for the part he'd played in letting their marriage unravel? The therapist's words from their last session echoed in his mind. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to others, Mark. It's a gift you give yourself. But was forgiveness even possible when trust had been so thoroughly shattered? Mark's internal battle. Mark closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. He thought about his parents' marriage, a union held together more by duty than love. His mother had been the peacemaker, always smoothing over conflicts with quiet resilience, while his father had been a man of unyielding pride. Mark had spent his childhood watching their silent battles, each one eroding the foundation of their relationship until there was nothing left but a hollow facade. He had promised himself he'd never let his marriage become like theirs. He had vowed to be different, to be better. And yet, here he was, standing at the edge of the same abyss. The past weeks had been a blur of emotions, anger, betrayal, and an aching sense of loss. But beneath it all was a question he couldn't escape. Did he still love Emma? The answer was both simple and complicated. He did. But love, he realized, wasn't enough. Not without trust, not without honesty. And those were things Emma had taken from him, leaving him to wonder if they could ever be restored. Emma's struggle. Emma sat on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the evening replaying her conversation with Alyssa, the truth of her words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. Emma had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to navigate challenges on her own. But now she realized that her self-reliance had come at a cost. Mark's absence felt like a chasm in her life, one she wasn't sure she could bridge. She had spent so much time building walls to protect herself that she hadn't noticed the ones she had built between them. And now those walls were crumbling, exposing the raw truth of who she had become. Emma reached for her journal, a habit she had abandoned years ago. She opened it to a blank page and began to write, pouring out the thoughts she hadn't been able to voice. I'm scared, Mark. Scared of losing you, scared of losing myself. I've made so many mistakes and I don't know how to make them right. But I do know this, I love you. And if there's even a small chance we can fix this, I'll do whatever it takes. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. She ripped the page from the journal, folded it carefully, and placed it on his nightstand. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. A pivotal choice. When Mark returned home later that night, he found Emma asleep on the couch, her face soft in the glow of the television. He paused, his hand hovering over the back of the couch, torn between waking her and retreating to the bedroom. He chose the latter, not out of avoidance but because he needed time to process what he felt. In the quiet of their room, he noticed the folded piece of paper on his nightstand. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers brushing the edges as though it might burn him. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the words. They weren't eloquent or polished, but they were real. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. The turning point. The next morning, Mark found Emma in the kitchen, her movements cautious as she prepared breakfast. She looked up when he entered, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied, his voice even. He held up the note. "I read this." Emma's cheeks flushed and she looked down at the counter. "I wasn't sure if you would." Mark nodded, folding the note back into his pocket. "It's a start." Emma looked at him then, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time, vulnerability. "I don't know how to fix this, Mark. But I want to try. I want to fight for us." Mark leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Fighting for us means being honest, Emma. It means not shutting me out when things get hard." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "And I will. I promise." Mark studied her for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all he saw was a woman who was just as broken as he was, both of them standing at a crossroads. A new path forward. Mark and Emma began rebuilding their relationship one small step at a time. They started with weekly therapy sessions, where they learned to communicate in ways they hadn't before. Mark opened up about his fear of failure, his struggle with feeling like he wasn't enough. Emma shared her fears of vulnerability, her constant need to prove her worth. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks, arguments that left them both raw, moments of doubt that threatened to pull them apart. But each time they chose to come back to the table to face their struggles together. Mark found himself journaling late at night, a practice he had once dismissed as pointless. It became a way for him to process his emotions, to confront the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. Emma, too, began to find solace in writing, her journal becoming a place where she could untangle the complexities of her thoughts. Conclusion. Some choices leave scars no matter which path you take. For Mark and Emma, the scars of their choices would never fully fade. But those scars became reminders, not of their failures but of their resilience. They learned to see each other not as perfect partners but as imperfect individuals trying their best. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark reached for Emma's hand. "We've got a long road ahead," he said. "But I think we're finally moving in the right direction." Emma smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. As long as we're moving together, that's all that matters. And in that moment, they weren't just a couple trying to mend what was broken. They were two people choosing to face life's struggles side by side, one step at a time.